Hey, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. Today we're going to talk about Firefight and the terrain in Firefight. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the different terrain types. You know, there are different terrain features in Firefight, even if you never see them on the table. And then we're going to do a breakdown and explanation of them. And then afterward, we're going to have a discussion on terrain at tournaments. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how dense a table might be, and then also how we as tournament organizers can improve the quality of life for our players at the events that we organize. And then in addition to that, I'm going to talk about some potential changes I'd like to see happen. And I'm going to talk about a terrain packet that we're actually going to test pilot in my group. And I've actually submitted it to the rules committee and said, hey, look, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here, but I feel like if we move to a system like this, it could be beneficial for the community. And we'll get into that towards the end of the video. So I do want to let you know I didn't forget about Night Stalkers. Episode 2 is going to be coming up soon. I apologize. Obviously, I came home from Adepticon, and life has been life. So I've had a lot of that type of stuff going on where it's just like getting back into the swing of things with kids and everything else. The Wasteland Warfare settlement videos I'm going to start working on this weekend. So some of that is going to start getting put out soon. And I am working on a Dreadball, kind of like Dreadball Blood Bowl comparison for those of you who have played one or the other, but not both. And I'm actually thinking I might do that with old TK just to kind of change it up. If you don't know what TK is, just look through my video history. I have a lot of fun making those videos, so hopefully you have a lot of fun watching them. If not, I don't know what to tell you. It's what's going to happen. So keep that in mind. And then we are going to be back on a weekly stream. It won't necessarily be games. I am planning on streaming a little bit later today. And I want to talk about Math Hammer and meta. So I want to stream that and kind of pose it as more of a discussion. And then we're going to even dive into it a little deeper in a month when I do my If That's How You Want to Win, you know, If You Want to Win That Way podcast that I've been working on with Dankless. That first episode of that is up, so I will have a link to that in the description as well. But enough of me talking. We know what you're really here for. Bamboozled you. Actually, I got to shout out Military Gaming Command first, militarygamingcommand.org. They're just a really great nonprofit that I love to shout out. So, terrain, and this is going to be in the order and as it appears in the app. We're going to talk about each feature a little bit, and then we'll kind of break them all down. There's a couple that we're not going to dive into, and I'll talk about why. You have open terrain, which would just be like the tabletop, right? There's nothing on it. It doesn't impede your movement. That's it. And then you have blocking terrain, and that's terrain that a model may not move onto or around for whatever reason. Maybe it's got such a precarious surface that you can't land on it. Maybe it's just like infinitely tall, so you can't, fly up it. Blocking terrain, I will say, feels a little weird in this game, and we'll talk about why when we cover it in a little bit more detail. Difficult terrain, which is a catch-all for pretty much any terrain that would be on a footprint, any kind of area terrain. It doesn't all have to be that way, but, it covers your ruins, your hill, or your forest, stuff like that. And again, we will dive deeper. There's also fortified terrain, and that generally pertains more exclusively to narrative games, and so I'm not really going to be diving into it because I focus from a more competitive aspect. And when you're doing narrative games, you have a lot more freedom to kind of do what you want with your rules anyway. And to be fair, the Mantic police aren't going to come arrest you just because you're not playing by the rules properly. But narrative play is a lot more freeform with how you interpret and use rules, so we're not going to dive into that. And then there's hills, and yeah, they're hills. That's what they are. So, all right. So before we really dig in, when I say footprint, you might not know what that means. I'm sure other games use the term footprint, but that is more colloquially used in 40K jargon, right? The ruins have a footprint. This has a footprint. And all the footprint is it's like the base or footprint of the terrain itself. So it's a physical representation of how big the feature should be on the tabletop. And a good example of that is, again, if you're familiar with 40K, you have all the little squares or rectangles for footprints. In most games, if you have forests, you have something designating what the area is that should be constituted as a forest, and then you put trees inside of it, right? Firefight has rules for features with and or without bases. So if I say it has a footprint, then it has a footprint. If I don't say it, then it doesn't. And just keep that in mind. So let's start off with blocking terrain. When you look at blocking terrain, you have units may not move across it and must go around it. Impacts line of sight based on height. Anti-grav still treats it as blocking. And this is where it's kind of weird, right? Basically, things that are too tall for anti-grav, such as massive buildings, any unstable surfaces that might not allow a model or person to walk on it. Blocking terrain should not have a footprint. It should just be the feature itself. And it can be any height. So this one's kind of weird because if it's height 2 and it's blocking, what is limiting an anti-grav unit from moving over it? And I'm not saying we shouldn't have blocking terrain. We absolutely should. There should be things that impede movement. But the issue is, what is it that keeps it? Like the logic gap. That's where my break is the logic gap. So if you tell me like this giant rock, and I think rock or boulder is one of the examples they use in the book. And it's just like, okay, but how does this prevent my anti-grav unit from moving over it? So that's one of those like suspension of disbelief things that just kind of messes with my head. But the intent is basically like, hey, this feature is infinitely tall, and unless you're a literal aircraft with fly, you cannot move over it. That's just the way it is. And those are good features to have because it forces everybody to have to work around it. Again, they shouldn't have a footprint. It should just be the feature itself. And it can be any height, which again, I think that's probably where my biggest break is like, all right, it's a height 1 blocking feature. But at the end of the day, use your common sense. Then you have difficult terrain. Now, difficult terrain has a footprint or a base or whatever you want to call it. Units may not sprint through footprints unless it is to make contact with an enemy unit, which will be hindered. So you can only make a normal move or an advance. And if you sprint, it's only to charge. And you have a hindered charge. A unit with its leader, and this is where it gets a little weird, a unit with its leader within difficult terrain will ignore the terrain when determining line of sight to units outside of the terrain if the leader is within 3 inches of the edge of the terrain to the target. Otherwise, difficult terrain affects line of sight as stated in chapter line of sight. A unit within difficult terrain that is of equal or greater height than it is always in cover. That's a word salad. And really all it's saying is that if you are trying to shoot out of the difficult terrain, you have to be within 3 inches of the edge of the terrain towards your target. So if you're here and you want to shoot this unit here, that footprint can't be more than 3 inches. There can't be more than 3 inches of footprint between your unit leader and the target, right? Like that's where you're at with that. Now you've got otherwise difficult terrain affects line of sight as stated, blah, 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 blah. That's fine. You can look up line of sight. We're not going to break that down. A unit within difficult terrain that is of equal or greater height than it is always in cover. So if you have a difficult terrain and it's supposed to represent woods, and let's say woods are height 6. I don't know what they are off the top of my head. There's a little chart that tells you. Doesn't fucking matter. If there's a little, like let's say they're height 6, if the unit's in there, they get cover because the terrain is as tall or taller than the unit. If the area terrain, the difficult terrain, let's say it's a crater, theoretically, The crater, if it's height 1, wouldn't give cover unless you're height 1. Now, I think this is kind of a superfluous rule because I think this is one of those where it's like, all right, if your unit is in an area of terrain, it should probably have cover. Like, you should be more likely to get cover than not get cover while inside of an area feature, right? Like, that's kind of how I look at it. So, to me, this is one of those rules that could just go away. It doesn't need to be equal or greater height, because, like, a crater is a great example. If you've ever seen an actual real-life blast crater, they can be massive. And you can literally get in them, lay down, and get cover. And from ground level, they might only be height 1. But once you're in it, they go down, right? So it's one of those, like, honestly, the best way to approach it is to just treat it as whatever height it is and just move on with your life, right? Like, don't worry about whether or not the height of the terrain is greater than the height of the unit for it to get cover. I would honestly just use normal cover rules. This is one of those situations where this rule feels a little weird and doesn't need to be there. Now, obviously, if you're at a tournament, this is probably how it's going to get run, unless you have a TO like me who's not afraid to make those like, hey, we're going to tweak this a little bit. Because by and large, I don't care. Right? Like, I'm here to make sure everybody has a good and fun experience. And if I think there's a glaring rule issue, I have no problems going, we're going to tweak this, especially for terrain and things like that, to make more features usable. Because that's what I want. I want more features to be usable so that you see more variety of terrain on the table. So if we make height 1 craters give everything cover for height 4 and lower, because height 5 you have a difference of 4, so you're in it, you get cover, too easy. You can even make it like height 0 and just say, hey, you get cover while you're in it, but then it doesn't give cover shooting over it. Like, that's a thing you could do as well. Moving on. Sorry for that tirade. A unit must have its leader and at least 50% of its models within the difficult terrain in order to be considered in cover, and this will normally be clear due to the leader and model coherency rules. So really all this is saying is that the leader plus 50%. The leader and at least 50% of the unit's models. So if you have a 10-man unit, the leader plus 4 must be in, because it's at least 50% of the unit's models. You could probably interpret that as the leader plus 5. I would interpret that as the leader plus 4. Basically, half the unit and one of those models has to be the leader, needs to be in it. That's pretty straightforward. I have no issues with this. It prevents some of the gaminess that can happen when you just step your leader into this like footprint and just be like, ha, my whole unit gets cover. Now, don't get me wrong, like, there's still ways you could do that, but the one thing to note is that difficult terrain is kind of a catch-all for a lot of features. Woods, ruins, etc. Like, there's a lot of things that are difficult terrain according to the rules. And they can really be of any height. But there are recommended heights for specific features within the rules. So, like, again, I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but it might say, like, ruins are height 2 or height 4. And then it might say woods are height 6. You know, I think difficult terrain is probably the sloppiest and worst interaction in this game. I think, and so when I say that, I love Firefight. It is hands down my favorite game right now. Absolutely love this game. I think it's one of the cleanest, best rule sets I've played in probably the last 10 years. And so for me to be like, hey, this is like the sloppiest, kind of shittiest interaction in the game, like, that's not a big deal. I would like to see these rules get cleaned up, and like I said, we will talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to give TK a minute to kind of talk to you about getting cool stuff like this hat right here, and then when TK's done, we're going to come back to our discussion.
Hello, sports fans. It is I, the handsomest, heroicest, most hilarious hard-ass to handle a sports desk. And it has come to my attention that some of you don't have my face on your chesticles. Old TK thinks this is not only obscene, but also absurd. So make sure you click the fourth wall link in the description to get one of your favorite TK quotes, as well as my gorgeous gob to adorn your perfect pectorals. Right now there are two to choose from, and like old TK says, two birds in the bush are worth one stone. Now, back to your program.
And then you have obstacles. Units can move over obstacles normally as part of an advance action, ending either side of them. That's a stupid sentence, and I copy pasted this. Units may not sprint over obstacles unless it's to make contact with an enemy unit. However, you'll have a hindered charge. So again, very similar to how difficult terrain would be. Obstacles are height 1. And a unit with its leader in base contact with and tracing line of sight over an obstacle gets to ignore the obstacle. So what this is saying is that obstacles give cover at height 1. So anything that's height 4 or less will get cover for being behind the obstacle. If you can do a regular advance over an obstacle, and that's fine. The only time you can sprint over an obstacle is to make a charge. And if you do so, it will count as a hindered charge. So very straightforward, very clean. All obstacles are height 1, very straightforward, very clean. If your leader is touching the obstacle but shooting over the obstacle, you get to ignore the obstacle. And that's just so, like, if you're touching the obstacle and your target is away from it, right? They're not getting cover for the obstacle that you're touching and shooting over. That's all that's for. And honestly, the best way to describe the way obstacles are written, this is just scatter terrain, right? These are your low walls and barricades, like the really small ones, maybe like some barrels, things like that. You could make the argument that even like craters could count as obstacles, except they're really big. That'd be, the downside. But that's to me what those are. And that's the intention here, is just like low things that you can hop over, maybe even like a fence. Like the fence might be higher than height 1, but because it's just like a chain link fence, you get to treat it as height 1 for movement purposes, right? And then there's special rules based on what type of movement you have for how you move over stuff anyway. Like wheeled and tracked and stuff all have their own special rules for how they move over things. So just keep that in mind. And then you have hills, and hills are kind of weird also. A unit's leader model must be positioned with all of its base on the hill for the unit to count as being on the hill. Any models in that unit must also be placed on the hill whenever possible. So if you want to be on the hill, right, this is where the hills are just weird and they don't follow the same rules as everything else. And this is one of those interactions where I'm just like, all right, I kind of get the intent, but it's kind of weird because it doesn't follow the logic that most of the other game follows. Your leader has to be wholly on the hill in order for the unit to count as being on the hill. And if you can, as many models as possible must also be placed on that hill. And again, I understand why. It's just kind of weird. If a unit's leader model is on a hill, then the unit ignores the hill when it is checking line of sight. Otherwise, the height of the hill will impact line of sight as normal, and hills are normally height 3. So really what we're looking at is almost like the hill is a footprint. It's a height 3 footprint, so in order to unlock the footprint, you have to be wholly within the footprint. And if your unit leader's wholly within the footprint, then you must put as many models as possible within the hill's footprint as well. Outside of that, you use the hill's line of sight as normal, and the hill is height 3. So this is where hills get a little weird, and it's one of those where at height 3, just stay off the hill, right? If you have a height 2 unit, just stay off the hill unless you need to shoot. And really, you're almost better off going around it. But the way hills are written, I'd almost not even put them on the board because they can just be replaced by things with better rules. Like, you could just put a forest on there. Yes, forests are difficult terrain, but the rules are a little bit cleaner, and they're just a little bit more, they make more sense. Now that we've gone through every terrain feature, let's talk about tournament tables and terrain. I want to lead this off by saying that organizers, we suffer because there's a lack of strong terrain rules in this game. So anything that I say isn't an indictment on any tournament organizer. We are working with the tools we have. Now, maybe your tournament organizer doesn't give a shit and they just put whatever on the table anyway, and that's fine. Like, that's between you and your TO. But with rules that don't make a lot of sense or aren't necessarily super clear and concise or just feel a little tacked on, it can be kind of a struggle for an organizer. And so one of the things I want to point out is, before we dig into the slide, when we did, and I already mentioned this, when we did Adepticon, there were totes of terrain that never made it to Adepticon. So the TO had to just like make do with what they had. Now, that being said, the tables were a little sparse because of this, but the game still went and everything still played. However, there was a lot of Halo terrain on the boards, and there was a lot of confusion with players. Now, because I tend to like absorb rules pretty well, I know most of this stuff. I'm not going to pretend like I know it all, but I know a lot of it, right? And so a guy tried to shoot me through a window, and I'll see if I could pull one up actually real quick. So a guy tried to shoot me through one of these windows right here. If you look how they have like these types of windows, the way Firefight's rules are written, you cannot shoot through those windows. You just can't. And he was like, these are ruins. No, they are not. Ruins have a footprint. They are under the difficult terrain section or difficult ground section. And it clearly says in that section that those have an area or footprint. These do not have it. So, therefore, these are going to be treated as blocking line of sight equal to the height. Now, obviously, a little bit of logic can apply. Like, if you're inside the building, let's see if we can kind of zoom in here. Not really. But if you're inside it, right, and you're shooting through those windows, I have no problems with cover in, cover out. Like, that makes sense. It's logical. However, shooting through it, not so much. Because the rules state, hey, like, blocks line of sight. Windows and doors don't really matter for a lot of the features. You know, the features that they do matter for are going to be features like ruins, where they have a footprint. Because even in there, and I'll see if I can dig it up in a minute, but even in there, it specifically says something about, like, the features don't matter. So it's one of those, like, I get it. You want to shoot me, there's a window, but you don't get to. Like, rules is written, you don't get to. Like, that's just how it is. And so, this terrain that we're looking at right now, as cool as it is, doesn't have a lot of functionality in Firefight. Because of weird things like, hey, there's this little, like, turbine thing that I can shoot through in this little section down here. You know, so because of that, it's just like, all right, so if it's open on one side and then you've got that little turbine thing, that fan blade thing on the other, I can see straight through it. But because it's height 4, it blocks line of sight up to height 4. And so a packet, and again, I'm not putting Aaron down because he did a fantastic job pulling that out of his ass and making it work with what he had on deck. But putting together a packet that, and this goes for everybody, like, I need to start doing this too. But putting together a packet that has, like, a picture of the terrain feature. So, like, we do a picture of these Halo buildings, right? And we just say, hey, this is what this does, this is how this interacts. And then just do that for every terrain feature. The downside to that is you're going to want to make sure you have the same group of terrain features on every board. So you may not have as big of a variety as you would like. But what you will have is you'll have consistency. And in a tournament, that's super important. Like, Table 1 and Table 2 might have totally different layouts, but the fact that the terrain itself is consistent is what's important. I'm not moving from Table 1 to Table 2 going, I don't even know what the hell this is supposed to be. And if you do have differences, then each table needs to have like its own sheet, like a cheat sheet. So moving back to that, each tournament should strive to use the same types of features, as just what I said, on all of their tables. They don't need the same layouts or even the same sizes or density, but if a table has a ruins or a woods, they should probably all have a ruins or a woods. What you don't want is a table, right, that has woods, and it's very clearly woods. But then you have a jungle-themed table over here, and you've decided that this footprint is a ruins, even though it has like jungle-y themed stuff. Because now you've got two things that might look similar, but might interact a little bit differently because of differences in height, etc. And so what I would recommend, and what I just said, implementing terrain packs in your tournament packets. It doesn't take very long. It'll take you maybe an hour or two worth of work to kind of like sit down, type it all out. But once you get it typed once, that should be it. And like I said, what you want is you just want a little picture of the feature and then what it's intended to be or how it's intended to work. The terrain rules seem to be kind of poorly understood in the community. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that they're just kind of poorly written. Again, I'm not knocking anybody because I think this is a fantastic game. And I think terrain is one of the hardest things for games to get right. It's one of the hardest things for games to really dial in and get perfect because it creates... It's such a big variable in the game. Because, like some people don't play with much terrain. Some people play with a lot of terrain. Some people like ruins. Like, because of the differences in terrain, it's just really hard to get rules that are good enough to be all-encompassing and to just work. So, again, I'm not knocking anybody. I'm just saying, hey, like, this seems kind of tacked on, seems a little poorly written, and because of that, it seems like the community doesn't necessarily know what to do with a lot of it. And so I actually have some thoughts on that. And this is what I was telling you. At the end of the video, we're going to talk about it. I think the best fix for Firefight, and I'm just as dumb as everybody else, so I'm not up here telling you what I think is right. I'm just telling you this is how I think it would fix a lot of that, like, misunderstandings. What I think the game needs is a little bit more structure for terrain. So we have these units and we have these universal special rules. And the units use them, right? So you have keywords like vicious. And then you just slap that keyword on a unit. And then we go, okay, vicious melee. I know what vicious melee does. Perfect. We can apply that same logic to terrain, right? So if we just create a bucket of keywords, like footprint, and that tells the player it's area terrain and it should have a footprint. Blocking, so you don't even have to change the terrain definitions. You just now make them keywords and you can assign those keywords to different features. So if you wanted to create a forest, right, or a ruins, you could give the ruins footprint. So we know the ruins has a footprint. We give it difficult, so we know that that footprint is difficult ground. So we know how both of those already interact. And then we give it a height, right? Height 4 per level, for example. And per level, I mean like story, right? So you could have like a 2-story ruins. And that's, to me, like, this is how you solve this issue. Is, okay, all ruins for tournament play, what you do in your basement is your own damn business. But all ruins for tournament play are going to be footprint. They're going to be difficult. They're going to be height 2 per level. And roughly 2 inches is a level if there's any confusion, whatever. So, then we can start creating standardized terrain so that there's no confusion. So that when players show up and they look at their tournament pack and they go, okay, all ruins have these keywords, and these keywords do this. And you could look at that Halo terrain, and you could just find the keywords that interact best with it. And you'll probably need to add a couple. But you go, okay, this has this. And we'll just make some up. Like maybe it has impassable, which means you can't move through the walls or doors, period. You have to go around it. And I'm just making things up as we go. But maybe it has something that says that. But then it has a special keyword that says you can get on it and you can climb it and all this stuff. Like in older editions of 40K, it was called scalable. And again, that just makes sense. Like, love or hate 40K, the 9th edition terrain rules were really well written. That was one of the peak, best terrain rules I had seen. And they just really shit the bed with them. Because this is the system they used. They were like, here's a bunch of keywords. You want to know what ruins do? They have these keywords. You go look them up. And it's literally so that the terrain interacted just like your units. And I think that using that system is a system that players would be used to because we already do it for our units. If you play Kings of War, you already do it for your units. And it creates consistency so that when you get to a table, you don't have two players going, man, I don't know what this does. Let's just play it this way. Because that's going to create some feel bads when some of those players who are maybe less experienced or a little bit lower skill level get paired up with players who are more experienced or a higher skill level. And those less experienced players have been shooting through windows all day. And then they're told you actually can't do that. And they're just like, oh. And then you got to pull up the rules, show them, get the TO involved, ask him, and then they're just like, yeah, no, that's not how that works. And they're just like, oh. So, this is my suggestion. Like I said, I put a little packet together. It's not complete. It's just a rough draft, more like a proof of concept. We are going to be play testing it in my group. I did shoot it to the rules committee. Once they review it, they're going to tell me to probably go pound sand up my ass, which is all right. Like, hey, dude, you're a good idea fairy. Keep your good ideas to yourself. Wouldn't be the first time I've been told that. So, but overall, like I said, I think this is a system that would work. And if it does work, I will probably be talking with the Pathfinders and seeing if maybe we can kind of, at least as Pathfinders, come together and go, okay, let's do a hot run of this terrain system and see how it works. Thanks everybody for watching. I appreciate it. If you like the video, make sure you give me a like and a subscribe. And, stay tuned for more content. I will be streaming in just a little bit. Thanks a lot.